really an exciting event. A lot of people that weren't here yesterday, so we're reaching new people. This lady here, don't fall over the bank, Barb. This lady climbing on the monument is Barb Greeno, who grew up in this house over here and spent hours of her childhood doing this. So we wanted to commemorate another historic Westminster moment. So there she is, Barb is also
I'm 87.
Barb's 87 and is a Westminster Historical Society board member. So, and a wonderful secretary of our board and every other board that she's on. So we wanted to recreate a moment. Obie wanted to take her picture, so that's why we made her do it. So welcome everybody. We've got some really cool people here. We have Carolyn from the Brattleboro DAR, and this is a DAR marker. She's up here in the beautiful purple wrap. And Laura Trishman from the Vermont 250th Commission, the chair of the Vermont 250th Commission, who says she was last here when the law office was transferred to the Historical Society. So that goes back a few years. We have three past presidents of the Historical Society. We've got Obie Lisai up here in front, and Ruth Grandy sitting back there waving her cap, and Pat Haas over here at the other end of the line. And let's see, others too numerous to mention. And in a few minutes we'll have Ray Boaz from the Walpole Historical Society speak. So I just wanted to set the scene. So here we are today, 250 years after the Westminster Massacre turned into an insurrection. And so what happened last night, 250 years ago, was that when we left this place in the afternoon on March 13th, the Whigs, what we would call them patriots today, the people who were working for liberty, and at that point in a framework of still being British citizens, had occupied the courthouse and had been promised by the chief judge that they could stay in the courthouse overnight unharmed. They were armed only with sticks, and had been met with a posse armed with guns against the judge's promise. And the judge said, well, that wasn't any of my doing that they brought guns, and I'll go out and take the guns away and we'll have a nice talk in the morning. What really happened is that the posse went down over the hill here to the Tory Tavern, which was, if you go past the dairy farm, there's a couple houses up on a little rise of land, and that's where the Tory Tavern was. And they had pretty much a liquid supper, as far as I can tell from looking at, they submitted their bar bill to the province of New York to get reimbursed. And it was an awful, it was like 4 gallons of rum. So they really did, they drank their supper and they made their plans. And in the meantime, there were about 100 people in the courthouse who drew up a set of demands. I always say it's like the left, we sit down and write a white paper, and then the Westminster guys went home to their houses, and the people who had come from out of town, from towns like Brattleboro and Fulham, which is now Dummerston, and Putney, kind of bedded down for the night in the courthouse and up in the courtroom. But they did, having been betrayed once already, they did keep a watch on the door. And it was a moonlit night, the moon wasn't quite as full as it was last night, but a pretty full moon. And the guard at the door at about 11:30 spotted moonlight on musket barrels. And they hollered to man the doors, and everybody rushed to the doors. and they had come up. Dan can correct me. I think it was the east door, but their accounts differ a little bit. The posse in their account that they wrote up the next day said that they marched up and told them to surrender, and they didn't, and then they fired. The Whig account that was written up a couple of days, not a couple of days, 10 days after, oh, thank you. Come hold my piece of paper. My lovely assistant and husband is going to hold my piece of paper. I'm going to look at this, but you can hold my piece of paper. So the account written by the patriots who were inside, it goes like this. About midnight or a little before, and this was written, they wrote this up in later, like 10 days later, March 1775. About midnight or a little before, the sentry at the door espied some men with guns, and he gave the word to man the doors, and the walk was crowded. Immediately, the sheriff and his company marched up fast, within about 10 rods of the door, and then the word was given, take aim, and then fire. 3 fired immediately. The word fire was repeated. God damn you, fire, send them to hell, was most or all the words that were to be heard for some time. And the first 3 shots went high. As I gather, most military volleys did with that kind of musket, and they slammed into the lintel of the door. And we have a piece of that lintel with a musket ball hole through it. And then the second volley took effect and shot several men who were crowded there in the doorway. And this is what it was. Dr. Well, heck, his name's eluding me at the moment. Anyway, this is what they wrote up. There was Reuben Jones, Dr. Reuben Jones of Rockingham wrote up their report, and this is what he says. There were several men wounded. One was shot with 4 bullets, one of which went through his brain, of which wound he died the next day. Then they rushed in with their guns, swords, and clubs, and did most cruelly mammock several more, and took some that were not wounded, and those that were, and crowded them all into close prison together. And if you had a chance to look at the model, there were 2 small cells in the downstairs of the courthouse. So they crowded them into those 2 cells and told them that they should all be in hell before the next night, and that they did wish that there were 40 more in the same case with that dying man. When they put him into prison, they took and dragged him as one would a dog, and would mock him as he lay gasping, and make sport for themselves at his dying motion. And that was William French, who was a 21-year-old young farmer from Brattleboro. And his father had been a delegate to the 3rd convention at Westminster just a month before. And other people were seriously wounded. There was a man who was apparently in a coma that they thought was dead already. And William French died overnight. They eventually did send for a doctor, and he died in the prison overnight. And I need my piece of paper now, I think. Just a... And many of the people who were not imprisoned, many of the people who were occupying the courthouse ran out the doors and escaped. There was a big fight. Remember, they only had sticks, and they ran out the doors, and they ran down, where we marched up from yesterday to Azariah Wright's place. And from there, Wright sent riders all over Southern Vermont, into Massachusetts, into New Hampshire, to rouse the local militia to spread the word. And meanwhile, the court officials, they used the courthouse was often used as almost like a tavern. The judges would stay there overnight, so there was a bar, and so they kept drinking and carousing all night, and while French died in the cell, and then in the morning, considerably hungover, they decided that they wouldn't hold court after all, but they would sit down and write up their account of what had happened. And so they did that, and some of them started to go home. And so a few of the posse sort of trickled off home, and there is an account about Grace Crawford out in Westminster West. And if you know where the Randy Crawford house is, that the brick house out there, that was where the Crawfords lived. And Luke Knowlton, who was one of the Tories, one of the loyalists, they were thirsty and knocked on the door and asked for water. And she knew what had happened because her husband was among those who had been, alerted and gone to over here. And she said, "We have no water for traitors." and since he was described as a polite man in this account, he said, "All right," and went on, thirsty. While the judges and court officials were writing up their account, people were gathering out here in this one street. This is a town where a town of women and children, young families, middle-aged couples with families. There are only about 100 grown men in this town, and not in this village, spread over the whole town. And by the afternoon, by this time on March 14th, 1775, there were 400 heavily armed, very angry men in this street, ready to take the courthouse apart, ready to shoot through the windows. The nonviolence thing was really in the rearview mirror at that point. They knew what had happened to French, and they were very, very angry. And it was the New Hampshire militia under the command of Colonel Benjamin Bellows who prevented that violence from happening. And if you're ready to come up and say a few words, I would love to have you talk about Benjamin Bellows. So we have Ray Boas from the Walpole Historical Society to fill us in about Mr. Bellows. So you want me to hold the paper or the...
No, if you can just hold it like that'd be great. Yeah.
All right, it wants to be really close.
At any rate, whatever it works, I can hear myself anyway.
Is that working?
So at any rate, I just want to thank you for calling me to join you, just as you called Walpoleans to join you 250 years ago today, March 14th. Some background. My late bride and I fortunately landed in Walpole in July 2002, going on 23 years ago. A lover of history, especially local around me, and learning about the area, I have always considered Walpole, Bellows Falls, and Westminster just one community sharing the Connecticut River. I've written 2 books on Walpole history, and each month in my newspaper, the Walpole Clarion, write a history article with local focus. So there's no need for me to cover the events leading up to the massacre and the massacre itself, but I wish to briefly tell you about Benjamin Bellows, how he established Walpole, and his second son, Benjamin Bellows Jr.'s involvement in the American Revolution, starting right here in Westminster. Sadly, some condensed histories read as though there was only one Colonel Bellows, later promoted to general. That's not the case. Actually, there were 3 Benjamins. A great source of information on the Bellows family is the historical sketch presented on October 11th, 1854 by the Reverend Henry W. Bellows, following the gathering of his descendants to the consecration of the monument in the Walpole Cemetery to founder Benjamin Bellows. Founder Walpole Benjamin Bellows was born in Lancaster, Massachusetts, May 26, 1712, to parents Benjamin and Dorcas Bellows. Before moving to Walpole, he resided in Lunenburg, Massachusetts from 1728 to 1752. In Lunenburg, he was commissioned in the Massachusetts militia and served as a local surveyor. Bellows, as a Massachusetts surveyor, was appointed in 1745 to assist in settling the boundary lines between that state and New Hampshire. Now, colonial New Hampshire Governor Benjamin Wentworth met and became impressed with Bellows, and seeing him a man with the qualities needed to settle a new territory, sought to persuade him to settle in New Hampshire, offering Bellows his choice of unappropriated lands on the Connecticut River. Bellows thought the township of Claremont, with its superior water power, to be the best choice. But since it was north of Fort at number 4, its location was still too vulnerable to Indian attacks. Bellows then decided on the township designated number 3, and he, with other grantees, purchased the township. Governor Wentworth signed their charter on February 13th, 1752. In 1853, he built the first garrison house or fort just north of the still existing building known as the Walpole Inn. And in 1762, he built his homestead, which is now part of the former inn. Benjamin Bellows, the founder, moved his family here, which included his second son, Benjamin Bellows Jr., who was born in Lunenburg, Massachusetts in 1740. The younger Benjamin held many offices, beginning as town clerk when he was at the age of 19. He was also a member of the New Hampshire militia. 250 years ago, when the call spread to your neighbors, the younger Benjamin Bellows marched his Walpole militia to the courthouse, where he and others surrounded it. From the Reverend Henry W. Bellows' speech, then Captain Bellows, and I quote, "got possession of the confidence of the mob as to convert their threatened lynch law to regular legal action. He persuaded the maddened people, who might otherwise have gone to the extremity of a general butchery of the royalists, to seize the principal men and carry them under his escort to Northampton, where the only strong jail could be found out of disputed territory." When word of the British march to Lexington and Concord reached Walpole, Bellows gathered about 35 volunteers on April 21st and marched to Keene to join the troops there, but they had already headed east. So Bellows and his men continued on to Concord for what became about an 11-day expedition. Now a colonel, Bellows' regiment was ordered in October 1776 to march to Fort Ticonderoga to help reinforce it. The attack did not come at that time, and Walpole's regiment was dismissed after 24 days of duty. Bellows' muster payroll for that October service is on display at the Walpole Historical Society, and listed on it are the 96 men who served during that campaign, complete with their times and service of pay. Bellows again marched to his regiment to Ticonderoga in June 1777, and later to Saratoga in September. But, as Henry W. Bellows stated in his speech, and again I quote, "his best military service he ever rendered was near his home, namely at Westminster on 14 March 1775, when he was simply a captain." Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ray. I have to admit, I'm one who didn't know how many Benjamin Bellows there were, so I've learned a lot today. That's really really cool, and I I have to say, Ray rearranged his vacation to be with us today, and we're just really grateful for that and for getting a picture. And I did not know that quote about his service here, and I think it's true. To just give a little bit of a flavor of the tone of what was going on out here, this is from a deposition of John Griffin of Brattleboro, who was among the crowd, not on the Patriot side, and was one of the messengers sent to New York to tell the governor and the assembly what was going on. So he said to Judge Daniel Horsmanden on the afternoon of the 14th, describing another party armed came from Fulham and Putney in the said county, consisting of about 40, who after putting it to a vote declared they would immediately fire into the courthouse and kill and destroy every person there. That the leaders of the party from New Hampshire interposed and prevented the horrid resolution from being executed by guarding all the doors and passages into the courthouse. That the said rioters from Fulham and Putney expressed the greatest indignation and concern in being disappointed of their intended revenge, and that many of them cried aloud with vexation. So yeah, they were they were highly exercised, and the nonviolence was a thing of the past, but they couldn't get at the people, and Captain Bellows had somewhat calmed the mob. It sort of deserved to be called a mob at that point. And at the end of the day, around about 4:30, so although they didn't have daylight savings time, so it wouldn't have been exactly like this, but around 4:30 in the afternoon, a couple of the leaders of the Patriot group just went in, just walked into the courthouse and basically suggested, hey, have you looked out the window? How about it? Why don't you surrender? And the accounts given to the government in New York were all about how they spoke abusively and they, said rude words to them. But given what was going on, I think they deserve to be judged by their deeds and not by their words. And so at that moment, they did surrender. And there was a great outcry. People were let in to see the body of William French, which was still on the floor of the courthouse, and kind of filing through and pressing their handkerchiefs into his blood, and the stairs and the floor were all, full of congealed blood and bullet holes. And this was their 2 or 3 year old courthouse that had been defiled this way. And the question was then, what are we going to do with the judges? And my understanding is it wasn't immediate that it was decided to take them to Northampton. There was some thought of parading them in front of the mob, and then it was decided that no, just put them in the cells. So they went into the cells. They were put in the same cells where William French died, where the prisoners of the opposing party had been just hours before. And at that moment, that was the government of Cumberland County essentially decapitated. That was the end of New York government here in this part of what's now Vermont. In the following days, they went out and arrested all the other members that were not at the courthouse at that time, other than the coroner. He still had a job to do, so that the coroner stayed out. But almost all the other justices and county officials were gathered up and put in those cells, and they began to think, what will we do now for government? But that's something that we'll talk about tomorrow. And a couple of people stand out as somehow not being swept up in this and not being put in jail, though they were on the other side. Eleazar Ranny, who had a tavern down by where Allen Brothers is, was definitely a Yorker sympathizer, but was not ever connected with anything that happened at the courthouse. And somehow John Norton, who served all the drinks and was, the man whose tavern was the Tory Tavern, was free to do whatever he wanted, and was a well-loved figure and a good friend of Ethan Allen's. And he was not put in jail, and he apparently had done nothing wrong, and lived the rest of his life here. So there were still a lot of nuances. One thing to know, Judge Chandler put in the cell, and I don't know if it was the exact cell that William French died in, but he himself would die in one of those cells just a few years later as a prisoner for debt. And one of those ironies, he became an ardent patriot, but nobody ever trusted him, and he became impoverished and was in prison for debt and died in the very cells right here, and is buried in an unmarked grave over across the road. So just before I introduce Laura Trishman, as it's Women's History Month, and this is really a guy story to a large extent, I wanted to mention Grace Crawford, who had the legend of refusing water. And this is in a time, on frontiers and wild places like this, hospitality is an important value. You give water to your enemy, and it shows the strength of the feelings that someone like her, who was one of the first teachers in town, and someone who was considered a lady and an intellectual, would refuse water to somebody marching through. The other two women who had a role, a very little known role, just up the street, Margaret Brush, the wife of Crean Brush, the arch Tory, and her stepdaughter Fanny were living. And after the sheriff had read the riot act, he and his men went over to the Brush house. Crean Brush, as an assemblyman, was in New York because the assembly was in session, but Fanny and Margaret were here. And Margaret was a very spirited woman, and I found this in a scrapbook that the Historical Society had, and this very little known story about Fanny, who will in a few years become Fanny Allen. So Mrs. Brush, who had been a widow Montezan, and so this story appeared in the Vermont Phoenix of Brattleboro, a newspaper, on Friday, March 22nd, 1805. So people were taking an interest in the massacre, that thing had happened a few years ago, and writing a story about it. And so they asked Fanny, who was, by that time Ethan Allen was dead, and she was married to her third husband and living here. And she told them this. Mrs. Brush, who had been a widow Montezan, told them, the sheriff and the judges, that if the judges were not women in men's clothes, they would give the order to drive the rebels out of the courthouse at once and bring the leaders to trial for treason, that they had authority in arms and had only to contend with traitors who would run at the sound of their own voices. Her daughter, Frances Montezan, told her that she thought they had a just cause, and to remember that there were Green Mountain boys on the other side of the mountains, and that Ethan Allen would come to assist them. Her mother answered that she should not be more surprised to see her sneaking after Ethan Allen than she was at that, and told the others that the girl was crazy, and that Sheriff Patterson that the king expected him to do his duty. And I just really wonder if that acted upon him and caused got his dander up and made him attack them in the middle of the night if that played some kind of a role. She was a strong woman. So there are very few speaking roles for women in the Westminster Massacre story, and that's definitely one of them. So I would love us to hear now from Laura Trishman, who is the chair of the Vermont 250th Commission and has driven all the way down from Burlington to speak with us.
Thank you. What fantastic weather you all got today. As Jesse said, I'm Laura Trishman. I am the State Historic Preservation Officer for Vermont, and through that I am the chair of the Vermont 250th Anniversary Commission. It's a big undertaking for us to be taking on for over a number of years. In December of 2020, Governor Phil Scott signed an executive order establishing the Vermont 250th anniversary. As of last December, there were 48 states and territories that had established similar commissions for this commemoration. In Vermont, we have 68 towns and villages that have passed resolutions related to the commemoration. So far, we're going to get more. Of our 14-member commission, it's made up of representatives from the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation, the Vermont Department of Tourism and Marketing, the State Library, the Vermont Historical Society, UVM's History Department, the Vermont Commission on Native American Affairs, Vermont History Museums, Revolutionary War historians, reenactors. The governor in his executive order made sure we had a really good cross-section of the people that could help commemorate this event. The purpose of the commission is really not to create events, but to encourage and promote the observances and commemorative activities marking the 250th anniversary, the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and the formation of the United States of America. Although not considered one of the 13 colonies, the residents of what would become Vermont played a significant role in the colonists' assertion for independence from Great Britain, from the Green Mountain Boys' successful assault at Fort Ticonderoga, to the Battle of Hubbardton, to the Battle of Bennington, where Vermont troops helped defeat a British force to set up the victories that turned the war in favor of the New Americans. I think this is a perfect opportunity during a commemoration to educate people. You'd be surprised the number of folks that have come up to me and said, I don't know why we're doing this. We weren't one of the 13 colonies. We weren't part of the fighting. And I'm just like, sit down, we need to have a talk. And I know, I am not assuming, I know that we are all here because we love history. And therefore you know something about Ethan Allen, Ira Allen, Remember Baker, Seth Warner. The stories about fighting for the right to lands that would become Vermont and for our national independence are told often, and their successes are celebrated. But as Jesse was just explaining to us, endeavors not often told, but are just as worthy, are those people like Grace and Margaret and Fanny and the Bellow. But also like Anne's story, a widow with 5 children who aided the American Army hiding supplies and food in a cave and people in the floor of her house. Dinah Mattis, a prisoner slave captured from General Burgoyne's army and freed by Captain Ebenezer Allen. Or remember the 50 delegates who were in a tavern during a storm, representing what would become Vermont in Windsor to endorse the proposed Vermont Constitution. People are like, how many folks signed that document? Can I get a copy of the signatures? I think my great-great-great-great was there. I'm like, no, they didn't sign it. They just endorsed it. Might have been because they were stuck there many days during a storm in a tavern. But these are the little things you learn. There are no actual signatures on the document. And then one thing that has come under the purview of my position as the Vermont State Historic Preservation Officer, are the 500 soldiers who died during the War of 1812 at a hospital in Burlington and are now buried in what is the residential neighborhood making up the Old North End. Every once in a while, I get the call as someone's doing an addition to their house. We found skeletal remains. These well-known and nearly forgotten stories are marked by roadside markers and recounted in our history books. But commemorations like the 250th present us with the opportunity to learn more, go beyond Wikipedia. Share these stories, visit these places where history actually happened, and explore your own ancestors and reflect on what has come, how our country has come so far. Today, commemorations have evolved, and we have the opportunity to examine our founding fathers, the leaders of the Green Mountain Boys, the Vermont delegates of 1777, the 2 Vermont-born U.S. presidents, and those who fought for our country, be it the American Revolution, Civil War, War of 1812, the World Wars, any conflict that we've participated in. These leaders have traditionally been put on pedestals, their flaws overlooked because of their successes on our behalf. But now we can grab the opportunity to judge them as people, learn who they were, understand more about their lives, although it's difficult to walk in their shoes from many centuries apart. Founding fathers like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, they were not perfect. They owned slaves. They had challenges of their own to overcome. Ethan Allen, Ira Allen, Remember Baker used extreme violence and intimidation against New York officials during land disputes. Benedict Arnold is one of the most interesting figures in our history. I was educated that he was bad, but he was actually a significant hero in the early years of the American Revolution. He helped capture Fort Ticonderoga from the British, delayed their advance on the lake, played a role in the American victory at Saratoga. But then he secretly negotiated to turn over West Point in exchange for money and a British Army command. Why? Why did these people behave this way? Why do they do these things that we now view are wrong? So I challenge you now to learn their motivations. If you have the historical documentation that allows this, in Westminster, you have a great deal of documentation to sift through. As Jesse was reading, I felt like I could see what was happening here, the vivid descriptions. And I am an architectural historian. To see the fact that you have parts of the courthouse was absolutely fantastic. Those pieces were here then, and that's where you can learn the history. Primary documentation, if it remains, is priceless. And history can allow us to learn more that takes a different perspective, learn from our mistakes and our successes as a country and as a state. It's a great opportunity of the 250th anniversary, and that's the primary agenda of the Vermont 250th Anniversary Commission, to support, highlight, endorse those opportunities to look again, to learn more and explore from a viewpoint about people who have founded our great state and nation, their lives and motives. And I applaud your Westminster activities here this weekend to allow such learning at a place where history actually happened. When I was a bit younger during the 200th celebration in 1976, I was asked if I would sign the Declaration of Independence, and I was like, yeah, absolutely, right next to John Adams. I was really excited about that. And my father was like, no, wait a minute. You need to read the document. You need to understand what this says. And then he asked me again, would you sign the Declaration of Independence? And I said, yes, I would, because I understood as an 11-year-old, what it meant, why those 56 delegates from 13 colonies signed it, even though their lives were threatened by doing so. I also later read, at my father's urging, what was removed from the document about slavery and some other items that are really important and ended up forging our 19th century history. I urge you to take the time during this semi-quincentennial to learn how to spell that word and say it, because I admit that took me a little bit, to read the Declaration of Independence, the Vermont Constitution, learn what pushed Benedict Arnold to become a traitor, why so many of our founding fathers owned slaves, what drove Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys to violence. You're not pardoning their behavior, you're learning to understand it. And that can help us as we move forward in our own day and time to make our own history. Draw your own conclusions. Beyond being the first to die at the Westminster Massacre, who are William French and Daniel Houghton? They were very young men, both born in Massachusetts, both one of 7 children. But what were they thinking when they came here? How did their families react after their deaths? The call to remember these young soldiers for their sacrifices on March 13th, 1775, became an undertaking of the Vermont General Assembly in November 1872. It was Bill H-116, which appropriated $600, as equal today to about $15,000, to commemorate William French and create a monument to him, honoring him as the first to die in the American fight for independence. But I'm thinking, they're both mentioned on the monument. How did that happen? This is what I want you to do. Think beyond. When you read roadside historic site markers, we're not telling the whole story. We're giving you enough to whet your interest. Go learn more. So I learned that H. Henry Powers of Morrisville sought to amend the act by having another monument with another $600 to honor Daniel Houghton. Senator Powers, according to the newspaper, read the Hall's History of Vermont to substantiate the claim that if it was right and proper to erect a monument over French, it was equally right and proper that one should be erected over the grave of Houghton. French had a headstone at the time. Houghton didn't have any marker. Senator William Shedd of Newberry suggested a single monument for just the $600 should honor both men's sacrifice for freedom and unity here. The town granted ownership of the plot to the state, which then undertook design and construction of the notable monument just across the street. The Vermont Anniversary Commission is encouraging you to reflect on who these young men were, not just that they died at the beginning of the war, not just what happened here, but who they were before, how their families were after, what Westminster was like after, and how it affects your life today, the sacrifices that they gave. The commission invites and challenges you to learn different ways to commemorate the anniversaries of the people, the history, because all of these places and these stories matter. I want to thank you for being such wonderful stewards of the monument, for keeping history alive in Westminster, and for inviting me to share in your commemoration. I'm really very impressed in how you mark history, you remember it, and you keep it alive. Well done.
I learned a lot from that. I'm so glad that we had Laura here, and I did not know that about getting Houghton on the monument, and I am glad to know it. And I just want to mention a couple of things. That Daniel Houghton was expected to live. He was wounded through the body, but they thought he would live, and he was carried to the nearest cabin, which was over on what would now be Jim Matteau's lawn, and it was owned by the Harlows. We have a couple of descendants of Eleazar Harlow's family here, and he died several days later just right across the road there. We're also lucky enough to have today with us a couple of descendants of William French's family. Sean, who's come up from Pennsylvania, and Howard, who's come up from Putney. And I don't know if we have any other family members of Houghton or French here, but we are very honored to have you. And I thought, so tomorrow's celebration isn't exactly the word, commemoration, we'll gather at the town hall. You can stop in early and see the museum, have refreshments, and hang out for a while. And then at 7, hopefully it'll be coming on dusk, and we will walk down to the cemetery, to the monument, and hold a candlelight vigil. We will have Michelle Boslin, who introduced a resolution commemorating the massacre in the legislature, which had I believe it's passed, and it's had its first reading last week, and I got to go up and be there for that. And we will sing, I believe, William French's epitaph. But many of you might not be here for that, and so I want to read it here to conclude. This is what was put on William French's stone. In memory of William French, son to Mr. Nathaniel French, who was shot at Westminster March the 13th, 1775, by the hands of cruel ministerial tools of George III in the courthouse at 11 o'clock at night in the 22nd year of his age. Here William French his body lies, for murder his blood for vengeance cries. King George III his Tory crew, that with a ball his head shot through. For liberty and his country's good, he lost his life, his dearest blood. Thank you all for coming, and perhaps we'll see some of you tomorrow.